Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Interesting story of the New York Times raises a legal question, the kind of which you'd encounter in law school. And I'm fascinated by these stories. I think you may be too, if you just like thinking about thought-provoking legal questions. But a man who lived in a cardboard box or a collection of cardboard boxes in New York City was involved in an altercation after somebody came by and kicked the box that he was sleeping in. And he defended himself, or he says he defended himself, against the man who kicked his box. And he was then arrested after using a knife on the men who kicked his box. And part of the defense is he's claiming he has the right to defend himself in his own home. And the box was his home because he lived in it. And the question is, will that fly legally? And no one knows the answer to that because it hasn't been litigated yet, but it might very soon well be litigated. Nikita Stewart and Jan Ransom wrote the story, the headline of which says he stabbed a student to defend his home. His home is a box. So Joseph Matos is who we're talking about, and he lived in a collection of cardboard boxes on the east side, which every night he'd put together and sleep inside. And then in the morning, he would disassemble them, collapse them, and stick them someplace, and then go on with his life, which is usually going to a soup kitchen, going someplace where he could take a shower, and doing those things, but he's basically living on the streets of New York City. And so one night in October of 2018, he said he was awakened by somebody who kicked the box he was sleeping in, and he was startled awake. He leapt outside and grabbed a knife, and there he encountered a couple college students. One of them says that he kicked the box thinking it was trash and did not know there was anybody inside. But Mr. Matos, who's 57 years old, is now facing decades in prison because he faces assault charges for stabbing one of the men and slashing the other. But he says that he was defending his home against attackers. Under New York's Castle Doctrine, a person has a right to protect his home with deadly force if he reasonably believes another person is entering without permission and is seeking to commit a crime. And of course, this all boils down to whether or not the cardboard boxes that this man lived in were his home. Okay? So this is a crazy case. The case highlights the vulnerabilities and responsibilities of thousands of men and women who live on New York streets. They estimate the number to be about 3,600 people at the current time. And of course, there was a story in the news not too long ago about a murder spree of homeless men in Chinatown in October, where a 24-year-old man with a history of mental illness and drug addiction attacked 4 homeless men, killing them with a heavy metal bar and critically injuring a fifth. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office declined to comment on this case, but in their court filings it says that Mr. Matos was acting out of vengeance and not self-defense when he confronted the students. They say that he was the instigator because he chased after the young men. And Matos, of course, says that the kick to the box, which he says they kicked near his head, was the first act of aggression. He says, I didn't do anything wrong. They should be prosecuting those guys. So he's facing 22 years in prison, and the story does point out that he's never been charged with a violent crime before, but he was arrested once for marijuana possession. Now, the district attorney's office has not identified the students, but their names have somehow hit the news. And so the night of the stabbings, one of the students had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.30, which is 4 times the legal limit for driving. Okay, that's important to point out. They weren't driving, but the man had that much alcohol in his system. And that man and another were visiting New York and looking for a strip club and late-night pizza when the incident occurred, according to some documents filed in court. Now, in an interview with the New York Times, the man with the blood alcohol content said he was about to turn 21 and was out celebrating with friends, and he said he remembered drinking and looking for pizza, but does not recall searching for a strip club. Now, alcohol does affect your memory at times, and also your decision-making processes. And he said, apparently, I was pretty drunk so I don't remember some stuff. His friend told him that I kicked the box where he was sleeping, and that's the reason he got mad. And the other man who was there did not respond to requests for comment. But of course, Mr. Matos, who is the defendant in this case, says that he was surprised because he thought he was being attacked. The kick happened near his head. He wasn't wearing shoes, so he grabbed a knife that he keeps handy to cut the twine and tape that he uses to put the boxes together and to protect him. And he says that he used that to protect himself. He says he told investigators about the conversation and the argument that he had with these people. Now, there's video footage of some of this happening, but the video, apparently the way it's framed, does not show the kick to the box, but does show Mattis coming out of the box. So there's a dispute about how many times the box was kicked. Mr. Matos is a native of New York, but occasionally travels as far south as Florida or Mexico during the winter months. He was being held on Rikers for about 6 months, but then somebody, an anonymous donor, put up $100,000 bail, and he's gotten lawyers now who are known for taking on challenging cases. And part of the challenge here, like I said, is the legal issue. Is that box, or the collection of cardboard the man's living in, is that his home? And you can argue this case till you're blue in the face, and I know some people will below. Feel free. That the district attorney's office has argued in court documents that the box does not meet the definition of a home because it is not a permanent structure with walls and a roof. And of course, you're going to have to go dig up court cases and see if there's court cases that say your home needs to have walls and a roof. What if you're living in your car? Could your car be a home? Could it? Could a tent be a home? Could a shanty be a home? Could a shack be a home? Could a structure with a roof and 3 walls be a home? I'm not joking here. These are all things that people could live in, depending on where you are. Now, one thing that I think a lot of people are going to get hung up on is whether or not it can be his home if he does not own the ground underneath it. He's on a sidewalk, or he's in front of a building, or he's on private property, or he's on private property that people are allowed to cross over, and he does not have explicit permission to sleep there, most likely. So could that be his home? And then the question also boils down to whether or not the doctrine of you protecting yourself in your home was designed to only protect those who own the property they're in, or if it's designed to protect you when you're in a place that you don't have any place else to retreat to. Because that's what most people are going to tell you, if you think about this, is that under the old laws in some states, you were required to retreat if you could before resorting to deadly force. And the question is, where do you retreat to when you are in your retreat? Referring to it as a noun. And so the idea was, if I'm in my front yard, I run into my house. If you follow me into my house, I got no place else to retreat to. I'm not going to run back out of my house into my backyard. By the way, my front yard is that way, my backyard's that way. But that's the question. And I can tell you, I'm familiar with people who live on the streets. Went to law school in Los Angeles, used to have to park way over here. School was way over here. Would routinely walk up Wilshire Boulevard to get to my law school, and would pass by 2 or 3 businesses that had indented, vestibules, and there were the doors here, and then the walls came out like this, and there was a place where somebody could set up shop and sleep in there. And they'd often be laying there covered with stuff, usually blankets or just several layers of clothing, and laying on something else and sleeping, because in Los Angeles you can do that. But on a cold night, you might see them sleeping in a box or whatever, and then they would often get up and move before the business is open, and they'd disappear. And so I remember talking to those people. I remember occasionally having them ask me for money, ask me for food, things of that nature. I might do a story on that. I may have actually done a video or have talked about that before. And then I can also tell you that I taught at the University of Detroit, which is downtown Detroit, on Jefferson. And the University of Detroit building has been there for a long time. And there's actually a complex there, because there's a newer building, there's an older building. It's actually attached to a church. And then there's a parking lot, and there's 2 different streets, main streets that it's between. It takes basically a whole block. And there were a couple of places around the building where people would find places that they could get in out of the cold or out of the elements. And when I taught there, would routinely park in the parking lot and come in through the back, and there was actually a back door. And the back door was up a little set of steps, but it had a roof over it, a little pillar. It was not completely enclosed, but it was decently enclosed. And I had a class once that I taught on Saturdays, and I remember coming in on Saturday mornings, parking and walking in that back door. And one day I came around the back door, and there's a guy sleeping up against the back door. And I very, very carefully and quietly stepped over him, unlocked the door, and pushed it very, very gently. And as I was stepping over him, I saw him actually look at me like that. And he goes, "Is there class today?" And I go, "Not for you. Go back to sleep." And I just stepped over him, closed the door very gently, and went inside. And he put his head back down, went back to sleep. Didn't bother me any. But, I'd have a hard time thinking that porch could be called that man's home. But the fact that the guy puts the boxes together, not one box, several boxes together, and seals it all up and gets in there, and he's sleeping in there, and somebody comes by and kicks it right next to his head. And this idea that someplace else in the story, the guy who kicked the box said, "I didn't know there was someone in there." There's probably blame on both sides of this equation. And I'm not saying that Mr. Mattis needs to get off scot-free, did nothing wrong here. Because number one, I wasn't there. I don't know. It's going to be for a jury to decide most likely. But the fact that you got two kids visiting town, drinking it up, who aren't old enough to drink, strangely enough, and they go by a box that somebody's obviously sleeping in and kick it. There are certain things you don't kick. Hornets' nests, boxes that people are sleeping in, other people's cars, dogs, cats, things of that nature. So, but like I said, as far as a legal argument goes, it's just an interesting one. And by the way, and I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but I have to mention one of my favorite jokes of all time simply because it's true. There was a band years ago. Band is called Living in a Box. And there's a few bands out there that have had songs that were the same title as the band name, such as the band Talk Talk has a song called Talk Talk. It's a very, very good song and a very, very good band if you like that kind of music, and I do. But the band Living in a Box had one hit, and the one hit was Living in a Box, which raises the next question: where are they today? Most likely, living in a box. There you go, my friends. Questions, comments, put them below. Let's talk later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Creative people don't see things for what they are. They see them for what they can be.